We are joined by Jonathan and Panikoff. He's a director of Scowcroft, a Middle East security initiative at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan, let's begin with the timing, the nature and the scale of the latest strike. So what did they tell you about Netanyahu's strategy and what he wants to achieve?
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me. Look, I think it tells us kind of two things. The first is that clearly the prime minister believed that Israel could not wait for the U.S. to even finish negotiations. It's clear President Trump did not want Israel to strike. The statement that you've seen coming out of the U.S. is far from supportive of Israel on these strikes. And the question is whether or not there was advanced warning that was sufficient that the U.S. even knew they were coming tonight, or it was just a guess that they might be coming tonight. I think the second part of this is about why Netanyahu thought that they couldn't wait. And that goes to Iran. And the reality is, even we saw today, and I think what was news that was probably looked over a little bit, the IAEA said that Iran, for the first time in 20 years, is not in compliance related to its nuclear weapons program. And I think the timing of that is actually quite important to give an indication of how close Israel thinks Iran really is to putting together a bomb. We've been saying for a long time now, maybe 12 days, 14 days. My guess is the Israelis think it's much closer, probably in the 2, 3, 4-day window. And they decided they just could not wait anymore, even with the U.S. diplomatic efforts that are ongoing.
Okay, Jonathan. So on the other side of that strike, of course, is Iran. What do its recent military posture and rhetoric suggest about how Tehran is likely to respond?
Absolutely. So I think we saw examples in April of last year, and then again in October, that Iran would certainly engage in a barrage of ballistic missile and drone attacks on Israel. And that was for attacks that were not targeted at the nuclear program, which is fundamental to the Iranian regime and how it sees itself. I think you should expect that Iran will try attacks that are frankly even bigger both in terms of the amount of ballistic missiles, bigger in terms of the extent of the drone attacks, bigger in terms of proxies from Iraq, which probably they will ask to launch attacks, certainly the Houthis. And so I think it's also why you saw some of the targets Israel seems to have hit tonight so far, from what we understand, were actually not just the nuclear facilities, but the conventional ballistic weapons sites, as well as senior ranking Iranian generals throughout the guards and throughout the standing army. And I think Israel was trying to get ahead of a possible Iranian response that they anticipate is going to be significant.
And in regards to regional dynamics, Jonathan, how likely is this to spiral into a wider regional conflict? Could we see involvement from Hezbollah or the Houthis or even Gulf states drawn into the fallout?
Well, that's certainly the fear that all of the states and groups that you mentioned have. I think the Houthis are almost a guarantee. They were continuing to strike Israel anyways. I think it's very likely that, unlike in October, you'll see a fairly significant attack by Iraqi militia groups. The question is a number of the other groups. Hezbollah has been rightfully diminished by Israel. Hamas, obviously, we know the situation in Gaza. But I think the Iranians really see their nuclear program and its survival as almost existential for them in the way the Israelis see it as existential for Israel's security long term. And so that means that the Israeli barrage and the Israeli strikes almost certainly are not over. There's going to be a number of them to come. What that tit for tat looks like, Iran's ability to respond, I think they will want to respond in a fairly big manner. And so when you can get off of the escalatory ladder is very, very difficult to determine. And so the potential that unintentionally Gulf states, the U.S. and its bases in the region, some of the other actors, what happens in Syria, I think all of that plays into this and is a real question mark. This could be the regional conflict everybody's been trying to avoid for the last number of years.
Pretty worrying, Jonathan. So let's talk about the U.S. dimension here. You did say earlier that the U.S. may have not had the prior knowledge of this attack, but Washington announced it was going to start pulling personnel and assets from parts of the region in advance of the strike a couple of days ago. Does that suggest maybe a tacit approval from President Trump, or has Israel truly acted independently here, perhaps even at diplomatic risk?
That is actually the $1 million question that's reverberating around Washington tonight. I'm getting it from a number of friends in the administration, from folks in Congress I know, from folks from the former administration. I don't have a clear answer yet. I think clearly the U.S. knew that there was going to be potential that these strikes would happen sometime, and probably sometime soon. Maybe this weekend, I think a lot of people thought, maybe after the sixth round of negotiations that were supposed to take place between the U.S. and Iran on Sunday. I don't know that the U.S. actually knew that they were going to happen tonight, or the scale of what was supposed to happen tonight. My guess is the Israelis said, we are going to strike, and that there was not extensive information about necessarily how big or all the targets. It's possible they passed it, but if they did, then the question is going to be, did the Trump administration and did President Trump himself try to stop the Israelis and stop them from doing so? Or did they just say, you do what you have to do? And if it's the latter, then the U.S. acquiescence plays an important role here. But I think a lot of us are skeptical of that because of the statement you've seen coming from the White House and from the State Department of real distancing, that this was Israel's strike, the U.S. had nothing to do with it. And surprisingly, when these sorts of situations happen, you almost always have a statement of U.S. support for Israel. That statement isn't included right now. That doesn't mean the U.S. won't help defend Israel. I almost certainly think the U.S. is going to, but it's a real question mark about the status of the current Israel-U.S. relationship based on tonight's actions by Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Mr. Trump's own messaging has been mixed, but I do remember him commenting on a potential attack, also saying the attack may help the nuclear deal with Iran. Do you see Mr. Trump now leveraging this attack by Israel as part of a pressure campaign to extract concession from Tehran?
Well, I certainly thought that was part of the plan beforehand, before the strike actually happened, that the Israelis are going to strike you if you don't actually come to a deal. Now I think it's harder. I'd be surprised if the sixth round of negotiations goes forward on Sunday. It's certainly possible that it still could. I think it would be in Iran's interest for it actually to do so, just politically, from a geopolitical perspective, though I think a number of the hardliners in Iran would object to that. And so Iran has its own internal tensions and pressures. I can't imagine that if the strikes continue, as I expect that they will, and this is actually just the beginning of a situation of Israel's operations to take out or destroy as much as possible Iran's nuclear facilities, that there's a real way and real path toward diplomacy for the nuclear program now at this point with the U.S. and with the E3. So I would be very, very surprised if that happened. But this is all happening in real time. And I think as the sun is coming up in Iran right now, we'll start to have a better sense of what was actually hit, what wasn't hit, and then how the Trump administration reacts if they say to Israel, okay, you're going to hold for now, and what Israel reacts then. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think the strikes are going to continue. But there's a lot more question marks than clarity at this point so early on.
Okay, indeed, Jonathan. Thank you very much, though, for coming in on the show and then sharing your insight with us. Jonathan Panikoff, Director of Scowcroft, Middle East Security Initiative at Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for speaking to us.